When discussing a disappointing game, people like to talk about the particular problems it has. Essentially, they ask each other, why is this game bad? But in this case, I think a far more interesting question would be, how is it bad? If a restaurant served you a particularly unpleasant dish, then it would be perfectly reasonable to discuss the why. But if you knew that the ingredients were top quality, the chef were experienced, he had all of the right tools, and his last offering was excellent, then I think it would make a lot more sense to ask the how. Hi, I'm Calivan, and today we're going to talk about Empire Earth 3, one of strategy gaming's greatest misfires. Now, I've already made a couple of videos on the first two entries in this series, so I won't retread too much of the same ground, but here's a tiny bit of necessary context. Empire Earth was a hugely ambitious game, perhaps overly so, but despite its many flaws, it was groundbreaking for the time and brought a lot of joy to a lot of people. Empire Earth 2 was created by a different studio, and although it was in some ways even more ambitious, it was a tighter, more coherent and very playable experience. Think of it like this. Empire Earth was a great sandbox, and if you had the time and inclination to learn to build your own castles with the sand it provided, then it had a lot to offer. Empire Earth 2 worked well right out of the gate. Whether you wanted to play scenarios or skirmishes, you could just jump in and enjoy all that it had, which turned out to be a great deal. That's the backstory in a nutshell, so let's move on. Empire Earth 3 was created by Mad Dog Software, the same studio who had released the second game in the series just a couple of years earlier. It hit the shelves in November 2007 and was critically panned by all and sundry, and I really mean that. It's very rare even for a bad game to score below a 5 or a 6 out of 10, but Empire Earth 3 managed to collect quite a few 2s, 3s and 4s in the initial round of reviews. And it wasn't just the critics. Players were equally unimpressed, and even the developers themselves decided it wasn't something they were particularly proud of. This probably explains why all mention of it was removed from their website only a month or two after release. So let's quickly talk about the why. It might not be the most interesting of the two questions, but it's still valid enough for discussion. The first and simplest part of this resides purely on the technical side. It was sloppy, really sloppy, and right from the very start of the game. The tutorial had some problems that could make it impossible for you to progress to the next objective. Tooltips were incorrect, research could break, preventing further unlocks, and many of the in-game events simply didn't work. The whole experience was littered with all sorts of problems, ranging from starting locations, build costs, unit vision, and incorrect game states after loading. Pretty much all games have some bugs on launch, but with Empire Earth 3 these problems were highly numerous and highly impactful, a lethal combination. There were also some real corkers in there. You could build structures belonging to a different nation if you knew the right hotkey, and in some skirmish games you could arrive on the battlefield already pop-capped but lacking any construction units. There was a pretty sizable patch released to fix many but not all of these issues, but that didn't arrive until a couple of days after launch. This was back in 2007, so it wasn't something that was automatically applied by your digital distribution client, as you probably didn't have one. And if you didn't know a patch existed or didn't actively find and download it, then your game remained problematic. And not just in the way of bugs. The first patch improved a lot of issues with unit responsiveness, something that would impact all aspects of gameplay, even if it wasn't specifically broken. I think it's worth noting that releasing a patch 2 days after launch is pretty much 2 weeks too late. By this time, all of the critics and anyone who had pre-ordered or bought the game on release has already had their experience ruined, and as such, most of the damage is already done. That said, Empire Earth 3 could have survived this if it wasn't for the other two big parts in this equation. When you're making a sequel, a huge part of your potential player base is always going to be made up of those who enjoyed what they found in previous installments. They don't need everything to be the same, and in many cases they don't even want everything to be the same. What they want is something that takes some of the gameplay, themes and style of what they previously enjoyed and builds on it with something new, interesting and enjoyable. Empire Earth 3 did very little of any of these things. It didn't feel like an Empire Earth game, nor does it look like an Empire Earth game. The art style is different, the nations are different, the UI is different and the gameplay itself is different. It's Empire Earth in name only, and if it wasn't branded as such, I don't think anyone would have even made the connection. The only thing that in some way connects it to the previous games is the fact that the technological progression takes place over several epochs. But Empire Earth 3 had simplified this mechanic to such an extent that the feature is almost unrecognisable. The first two games had something like 15 of these that covered the entire span of organised humanity, starting out with not much more than cavemen and ending with combat walkers and laser rifles. The high number of these epochs and the effort you would need to undertake to progress through them created a very different type of game, whereas the 5 provided by Empire Earth 3 doesn't really set it much apart from something like Age of Empires. Sure, you start out with bows and you end up with lasers, but because everything's so compacted, it just doesn't feel like an Empire Earth game. With a lack of kinship to the previous titles and all of the initial technical problems, it would have been unlikely that Empire Earth 3 could have succeeded, but not impossible. Every now and again, a game is released in a pretty poor state, but through careful patching and improvement manages to regain player trust and become a modest success. Look at Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. That game was broken to such a point on release that it was literally impossible to progress through the story, but after some official and unofficial patches it was restored and is now fondly remembered by many. On the other side, Dawn of War 2 was a pretty far departure from the first game, and although it may have alienated many of the fans of the original, it did go on to find its own audience. So the third, and I think the most problematic sin committed by Empire Earth 3 is that it's boring. Sure, you can pick apart interactions and mechanics and describe in great detail why each individual choice is a bad one, but I don't think any of that's necessary. Everything in this game is just so bland. It's like a meal consisting of overly boiled potatoes and vegetables without a hint of sauce, spice or herbs. It's technically food, sure, but it's the kind of meal you would choose only if nothing else was available. Something to be endured rather than enjoyed. The units, buildings and mechanics are also uninspired, unimaginative and uninteresting. It feels like the result of an experiment where someone tried to combine Warcraft 3 and Age of Empires 2, while at the same time removing all of the things that made both of those games enjoyable. Worse still, the only time the game isn't boring is when it's annoying.
Which way am I a funny guy? Which way am I a funny guy? Which way am I a funny guy? Which way am I a funny guy?
Funny how? I mean, what's funny about it?
Pathfinding is frustrating. It uses a rock, paper, scissors style combat system, but it's hard to get the counter to attack the relevant unit. And the vocal responses of your troops combine a failed attempt at humour with a high degree of repetition.
Which way am I a funny guy?
I think Jeffrey Hunt at Game Revolution really managed to hit the nail on the head in the closing sentence of his review. If the game didn't try to make you hate it, it would be perfectly tolerable. And tolerable is all it would be. Not enjoyable, certainly, but perhaps tolerable. And that's the problem. Tolerable is something that might be acceptable during your workday, or perhaps at an appointment with your dentist, but it's not a word you want to associate with your leisure time. The one thing it really reminds me of is something that doesn't exist. Often on my channel I mention a game called generic RTS. It's a term I use when I want to compare an interesting feature with the absolute default way of doing things. Most real-time strategy games I discuss have a few things in common with generic RTS, but that isn't what defines them. They all have their own interesting mix of gameplay, features and quirks that sets them apart from one another. But not Empire Earth 3. In many, if not most ways, Empire Earth 3 is generic RTS. And there's only one thing that might just save a game this mechanically bland, and that's an interesting, intriguing and involving story campaign that you can really get wrapped up in. But Empire Earth 3 makes no attempt at any type of storytelling. So that's the why, but perhaps more interestingly, how? How did Empire Earth 3 turn out like this? Mad Dog Software was full of experienced and capable people. The preceding game was not only solid, but showed an understanding of the franchise and built on the themes of its predecessor. The team that created the second game was still in place, and they had expanded to include even more creative and talented people. People like Gary Freeman, someone who worked on the art team for Tiberium's Son and was now Mad Dog's lead concept artist. People like Ben Wilson, who had been at Stainless Steel Studios and worked on the first Empire Earth game. These people understood games and they understood Empire Earth. My first thought was perhaps ambition, as this has been the downfall of more projects than can be counted. Many a development studio has tried to make a 4 million real game with only 400,000 in their pocket, and Fortress Accident SCA is no exception. But this theory doesn't appear to fit the facts. Empire Earth 2 was successful enough for the publisher to be interested in a third game. Sierra were not afraid of ambitious projects back in the day, and if anything, I think Empire Earth 3 can be characterized as severely lacking in ambition rather than having an overabundance of it. My second train of thought was perhaps one of chronic incompetence. A game might not be ambitious, but that doesn't mean that the project isn't a little above the abilities of those tasked with its design and implementation. But like we said, Mad Dog Software was staffed by a lot of competent people with a proven track record. So what about leadership? As a journey is only as good as its direction, but again there's no real clues there. The owner of Mad Dog and the creative lead on Empire Earth was Ian Lane Davis. He headed up all of Mad Dog's previous projects, and after Mad Dog were acquired he would go on to lead Rockstar New England to be responsible for both Red Dead Redemption games and GTA 5. So what about outside influences? Sometimes a studio will try and capitalise on a current trend with an ill-advised attempt to blend it into their existing game or development plan. You can see this with Dawn of War 3, where an obvious segue was made to try and incorporate MOBA-like elements into the multiplayer game design. The problem with this train of thought is I can't find anything that fits. Empire Earth 3 is so devoid of ideas, even bad ones, that looking back at a list of games released shortly before or during its development cycle does not reveal any clues. It doesn't have any of the telltale signs of someone trying to crack the Asian market or the pro scene, nor does it feel like it was designed for consoles or mobile crossovers. There are a few remaining avenues of investigation. Sometimes projects are half-arsed out of the gate just to meet some sort of legal condition or deadline. If you're familiar with B-movies, you might know about Roger Corman's version of the Fantastic Four. There is some dispute about actual intentions, but essentially the story goes as follows. A German production company acquires the rights to the Fantastic Four for a bargain price, but they haven't made a movie yet, and the only way to keep hold of those rights is to do so. Enlisting B-movie director Roger Corman, and with a budget of $1 million and a 25-day schedule, they bash out a Fantastic Four film which is never officially released. However, I don't think this can be the case for Empire Earth 3. The game had a $10 million budget and was in development for 2 years. If you did need to bash out a quick and dirty Empire Earth sequel for some sort of legal reason, I think it would have just been easier to start with Empire Earth 2 and throw in a few tweaks and graphical updates. Ironically, that probably would have sold better. But what else? Well, another thing that can cause a bland and uninspiring game to hit the shelves is one of intellectual property tie-in. New blockbuster on the horizon? Crank out a quick video game to suck up some of that brand recognition cash. This is obviously not the case with Empire Earth 3, but it's worth mentioning that Mad Dog would have some experience with this in the future. In 2008, under the Rockstar brand, they would be responsible for the very unsuccessful Iron Man game that was released alongside the very successful Iron Man movie. This brings us back to our original question: how did Empire Earth 3 turn out like it did? We've explored ideas of budget, competency, ambition, interference, trends and leadership, and we've come up empty. Only one other reason remains. Occam's razor does so often appear to hold true in these cases, so perhaps the simplest explanation is the best one. What am I talking about? Well, to put it plainly as I can, they done goofed. It's a pretty mundane reason, I know, but it just happens from time to time. Even great inventors and artists have their off days. Empire Earth 3 was their Sinclair C5, their Chinese democracy, their Jack. We'll never know exactly how it all came together, but I'll tell you one thing, I bet it looked really good on paper. They probably had big discussions about some of the problems and limitations with the first 2 Empire Earth games. You can imagine them looking at the limited early 3D graphics, the high degree of complexity and the fixed duration campaigns, and then coming up with solutions that sounded perfectly reasonable at the time. There aren't enough scenarios and missions, so let's make a dynamic open-ended campaign. All of the models look dull and unexciting, so let's replace them with highly detailed and exaggerated representations. How can we simplify the game to make it more easily accessible? Let's scale back the resources, gathering and upgrade paths. They wouldn't have thought it as dumbing down, instead they would have used positive words like streamlining and phrases such as focusing on the core essence of the game. Somebody probably called the first 2 games a bit dry, so they thought let's bring a bit of life into it by adding some humour and a touch of fantasy. It's not hard to imagine a world where each person was laser focused on their own individual task and really put their heart into doing a great job, each working on their own part of the plan and slotting it into the ever-evolving game until at one point, someone took a step back, looked at the big picture and said to themselves, "Ah, crap." There was probably a small, inevitable period of doubt and then a slightly longer period of denial, but by then it was far too late. They had an absolute stinker on their hands, and their only choice was to release it, hope for the best, and then move on to something new. Before we wrap up, I've said in a previous video that it's unlikely we'll see another Empire Earth game as it's now owned by Microsoft ever since the Activision Blizzard purchase. And you can see how the people at Microsoft would think it's too close to Age of Empires and wouldn't want to release something that competes with one of their other IPs. However, this might not be entirely accurate. I've recently read that a load of old Sierra assets were sold off when Activision merged with Vivendi to create Activision Blizzard. If this information is correct, Empire Earth is actually owned by Rebellion Developments, a British company headed up by Jason Kingsley. If you've not heard of Jason Kingsley, he was knighted for services to the economy, and as such you can find him on YouTube, dressed in a suit of armour and riding a horse while teaching his viewers about medieval history. I'm not sure if that makes another Empire Earth game more or less likely, but it's certainly something. So, that's Empire Earth 3. We all know it's bad, we all know why it's bad, and maybe now we've got half an idea on how the bad happened. Either way, don't play it. Even if you have a nostalgic curiosity, or a glutton for punishment, or just love to root for the underdog, give this one a miss. But not because it's buggy, or dumbed down, or unlike the other games in the series, but because it commits the greatest faux pas any game can. It's boring. We might like a challenge, we might like a story, but we play games to be entertained, and Empire Earth 3 simply does not do that. Hi there, thanks for sitting through my breakdown of a failure. If you enjoyed this video then please click the like button, and if you've got something to add then do so in a comment or come say hi on the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.